Every woman deserves to feel safe in her own home. Every heart deserves to be cherished, not crushed by the very hands that promised to protect it. Vivian Hayes thought she knew what love looked like when she agreed to marry Cain, but his charm turned to control, his sweet words to harsh demands. When his anger became dangerous, Vivian had to make a choice that would change everything. She agreed to marry his brother instead. Knox was everything Cain wasn't, quiet where Cain was loud, gentle where Cain was harsh. The whole town thought she was crazy for choosing the silent giant who kept to himself on the family ranch. What they didn't know was that Knox had been quietly loving Vivian from a distance for years. What happens when a woman running from one brother finds her heart with the other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Falls, a town that had seen better days but still held onto its dignity like an old man clutching his last dollar. The wooden sidewalks creaked under the weight of daily and commerce, and the smell of fresh bread from Murphy's bakery mingled with the earthy scent of horses and leather from the livery stable. This was a place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were currency and reputation meant everything. Vivian Hayes stood at the window of the one-room schoolhouse, watching the children play in the yard during their morning recess. At 24, she possessed a quiet beauty that drew second glances, auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, green eyes that held both intelligence and kindness, and a gentle way of speaking that made even the most troubled child feel heard. She'd been teaching here for 3 years, ever since her Aunt Martha had passed and left her with little more than a small cottage and the determination to make her own way in the world. The schoolhouse door opened with its familiar squeak, and Vivian turned to see Mrs. Patterson entering with her usual basket of fresh apples for the children. "Good morning, dear," the older woman said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who had watched Vivian grow from a shy girl into a capable young woman. "I see you're watching the Henderson boy again. Still giving you trouble?" Vivian smiled, shaking her head. "Little Thomas just needs patience. He reminds me of someone I used to know, always thinking faster than his hands can move." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the window again. "Some people just need a little extra understanding." Mrs. Patterson followed her gaze and nodded knowingly. "Speaking of understanding, I hear congratulations are in order. The whole town's talking about your engagement to Cain Morrison." The mention of his name brought a flutter to Vivian's stomach, part excitement, part something she couldn't quite name. Cain Morrison was everything a woman in Cedar Falls was supposed to want in a husband. He owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, had a smile that could charm the stars from the sky, and possessed the kind of confidence that filled a room the moment he entered it. When he had asked her father's permission to court her, a formality since her father had been dead for 10 years, even stern Aunt Martha had called it a blessing from above. "Yes," Vivian said, her fingers unconsciously touching the simple gold band on her left hand. "We're to be married next month." "And Knox?" Mrs. Patterson asked gently. "How does he feel about his brother's good fortune?" The question caught Vivian off guard, as it always did. Knox Morrison was Cain's younger brother by 2 years, though you wouldn't know it to look at them. Where Cain was gregarious and commanding, Knox was quiet and thoughtful. Where Cain filled every space with his presence, Knox seemed to blend into the background, watching and listening with those dark eyes that missed nothing. "Knox is," Vivian began, then stopped. How did she describe Knox? He was the one who had quietly repaired her schoolhouse steps without being asked. The one who always tipped his hat when he saw her in town, but rarely spoke more than a few polite words. The one who just last week had left a small wooden horse on her desk, beautifully carved, perfectly proportioned, with no note or explanation. When she had asked Cain about it, he had shrugged and said his brother was always whittling something. "Knox is a good man," she finished simply. Mrs. Patterson studied her with the knowing eyes of someone who had seen 7 decades of human nature. "Yes," she said quietly, "he is." The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention back to the window. Cain Morrison rode up to the schoolhouse on his magnificent black stallion, sitting tall in the saddle with the easy grace of a man born to command. Even from a distance, Vivian could see the flash of his white teeth as he smiled and waved. Several of the children ran to the fence to admire his horse, and Cain leaned down to ruffle little Mary's hair with the casual affection of someone used to being adored. "I should go," Vivian said, smoothing her skirts and checking her reflection. In the small mirror by the door, Cain didn't like to be kept waiting, and she had learned that it was easier to accommodate his preferences than to explain why she couldn't. She stepped outside into the warm afternoon air, and Cain immediately dismounted, striding toward her with his arms outstretched. "There's my beautiful bride-to-be," he said loudly enough for half the town to hear. He swept her into an embrace that lifted her feet off the ground, spinning her around as she laughed, despite herself. "Cain, please," she said breathlessly when he set her down. "The children are watching." "Let them watch," he said, his blue eyes sparkling with mischief. "They might as well learn what real love looks like." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "Have I told you today how lucky I am?" The words should have made her heart sing, but there was something in his tone, a possessiveness that made her feel more like a prize he had won than a woman he loved. She pushed the thought away, reminding herself that Cain was passionate, not possessive. There was a difference, wasn't there? "You're too generous with your compliments," she said, stepping back slightly. "What brings you to town today?" "Business with the bank," he said, his expression shifting to something more serious. "Old Henderson's been having trouble with his mortgage payments. I might have to foreclose on his property." Vivian's heart sank. The Hendersons were good people, who had hit a string of bad luck. Drought, sick cattle, and now little Thomas's mother was expecting another baby. Surely there's something that can be done, some way to give them more time. Cain's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Business is business, Vivian. I can't run a charity." His tone carried a note of finality that she had learned to recognize, the voice he used when he considered a subject closed. "Of course," she said quietly. "I just thought—" "Don't trouble yourself with such matters," he interrupted, his smile returning as he took her hand. "That's what you have me for, to handle the difficult decisions so you don't have to worry your pretty head about them." The phrase struck her wrong, though she couldn't say why. She was an educated woman who ran her own classroom and managed her own household. She was perfectly capable of understanding business matters, even if she disagreed with them. But Cain was looking at her with such affection that she found herself nodding and smiling instead of voicing her objections. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his saddlebag and producing a small velvet box. "A little token of my appreciation for being so understanding." Inside the box was a delicate gold bracelet, set with small diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. It was beautiful and expensive, too expensive for a schoolteacher's simple tastes. "Cain, it's lovely, but I couldn't—" "Of course you can," he said, fastening it around her wrist before she could protest further. "Nothing's too good for my future wife. Besides, you'll need to start dressing the part. The wife of Cain Morrison. Can't go round looking like—" He stopped himself, but not before the implication hung in the air between them. "Looking like what?" she asked quietly. His smile never wavered. "Like anything less than the queen you are," he said smoothly. But something in his eyes suggested that wasn't what he had been about to say. A distant rumble of thunder drew their attention to the western horizon, where dark clouds were gathering despite the morning's clear skies. "Looks like rain," Vivian observed, grateful for the change of subject. "Good," Cain said, swinging back up onto his horse. "The land's been too dry lately. A good storm will set things right." He leaned down to give her one more kiss, this one harder and more demanding than she was comfortable with in public. "I'll see you Sunday for dinner. Mother's planning something special." As he rode away, Vivian touched her lips absently, watching his figure disappear down the dusty street. She should feel happy, she told herself. She was engaged to the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties, a man who showered her with gifts and attention. So why did she feel like something was slowly slipping away from her, like sand through her fingers? Miss Hayes, little Thomas. Henderson appeared at her elbow, his freckled face worried. Is my papa really going to lose our house? The question hit her like a physical blow. She knelt down to the boy's level, looking into his eyes that were far too old for his 8 years. I don't know, Thomas, she said honestly, but whatever happens, you and your family will face it together. That's what families do. He nodded solemnly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a roughly carved wooden horse, clearly made by inexperienced hands. I made this for you, he said shyly. It's not as good as the other one, but I wanted you to have it. Vivian's throat tightened as she accepted the simple gift. It's beautiful, Thomas. Thank you. She looked at the little horse, comparing it in her mind to the one that had appeared on her desk, the one with its perfect proportions and smooth finish, the one that spoke of patient skill and careful attention to detail, the one that Knox had made. The realization hit her like a revelation. Knox had carved that horse for her, had spent hours working on it, perfecting every detail. He had left it for her without expecting thanks or recognition, without any thought of reward. It was a gift, given simply for the joy of giving. So different from Cain's expensive bracelet that felt more like a brand of ownership than a token of affection. Thunder rumbled again, closer this time, and Vivian herded the children inside as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. As she settled them with their afternoon lessons, her thoughts kept drifting to the 2 brothers, one who commanded attention and demanded acknowledgement, and one who worked quietly in the shadows, asking for nothing. She pulled out the wooden horse Knox had carved and set it on her desk next to Thomas's crude attempt. They were both gifts of the heart, she realized, but they spoke of very different kinds of love. One was given freely, asking nothing in return. The other came with expectations, obligations and conditions she was only beginning to understand. Outside, the storm gathered strength, and Vivian couldn't shake the feeling that the weather wasn't the only thing about to change in Cedar Falls. Something was shifting in the air, in her heart, in the very foundations of the life she thought she understood. And for the first time since accepting Cain's proposal, she found herself wondering if security and love were really the same thing after all. The wooden horse seemed to watch her with knowing eyes, and she found herself tracing its smooth lines. With her finger, thinking of the patient hands that had shaped it and the quiet man who had given it life. Knox Morrison might live in his brother's shadow, but his gifts, she was beginning to realize, came from a much deeper place than mere showmanship. The question was, what was she going to do about it? The church social was in full swing when everything changed. The entire town had gathered in the whitewashed community hall, tables groaning under the weight of potluck dishes, and the air filled with the warm buzz of conversation and laughter. Vivian stood near the dessert table, accepting congratulations on her upcoming wedding from the steady stream of well-wishers who approached her throughout the evening. You look radiant, dear, Mrs. Murphy said, squeezing Vivian's hand warmly. Cain's a lucky man to have found such a treasure. Vivian smiled and nodded, though the compliment felt hollow. She had worn her best dress tonight, a soft blue cotton with tiny pearl buttons that had belonged to her mother, and Cain had insisted she wear the diamond bracelet he'd given her. It felt heavy on her wrist, catching the lamplight with every movement and drawing attention she didn't particularly want. Across the room, she could see Cain holding court with a group of local businessmen, his voice carrying over the general. Din as he regaled them with some story that had them all laughing. He was in his element here, the center of attention, commanding the room with his natural charisma. When he caught her eye, he winked and raised his glass of punch in a silent toast. Knox stood quietly in the corner near the back door, nursing a cup of coffee and listening to old Mr. Patterson tell one of his endless war stories. Even in the crowded room, he seemed somehow apart from it all, watching rather than participating. When their eyes met briefly across the room, he nodded respectfully before looking away, and Vivian felt that strange flutter in her chest again, the one she'd been trying to ignore for weeks. "Vivian, honey, there you are!" Cain's voice boomed as he approached, slightly louder than necessary and carrying the slight edge that meant he'd had more than punch to drink. "I've been looking everywhere for you. I've been right here," she said mildly, noting how several nearby conversations had quieted to listen. "Mrs. Patterson was just telling me about her new quilting pattern." "Quilting?" Cain laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Lord, what a waste of time. You won't need to worry about such nonsense once we're married. I'll keep you plenty busy with more important things." The comment stung, though Vivian couldn't say exactly why. Quilting was a respected craft in Cedar Falls, and Mrs. Patterson's work was admired throughout the county. To dismiss it as nonsense seemed unnecessarily cruel. "I happen to enjoy needlework," she said quietly. Cain's smile faltered for just a moment. "Of course you do, sweetheart. I just meant you'll have more important duties as my wife." His hand found her elbow, gripping it just a little too tightly. "Speaking of which, I think it's time we headed home. I need to speak with you privately." "The evening's just getting started," Vivian protested, glancing around at the lively gathering. "And I promised to help with the cleanup." "Let someone else worry about the dishes," Cain interrupted, his grip tightening imperceptibly. "My future wife has better things to do than play servant to the whole town." The words hit like a slap. Vivian had been helping with church socials since she was old enough to carry a plate, and the women of Cedar Falls were her friends and neighbors, not people she was too good to help. "Cain, that's not..." "What's not what?" His voice had taken on a dangerous edge that she'd never heard before, though his smile remained fixed in place. Several people had stopped their conversations entirely now, sensing the tension. "Are you arguing with me, Vivian?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Vivian was acutely aware of the watching eyes, the listening ears, the way the room had gone quiet around them. This was not the time or place for a confrontation, but something in Cain's tone made her spine stiffen with defiance. "I'm simply saying that I made a commitment to help tonight," she said, keeping her voice level despite the tremor she felt inside. "I intend to honor it." Cain's face darkened, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes that sent a chill down her spine, something cold and angry and utterly without warmth. His hand moved from her elbow to her wrist, his fingers closing around the diamond bracelet he'd given her. "You'll honor your commitments to me first," he said, his voice low, but carrying clearly in the suddenly silent room. "Or perhaps you need a reminder of where your loyalties should lie." His grip tightened, and Vivian gasped as the bracelet's setting bit into her skin. The pain was sharp and immediate, but worse was the humiliation of having this scene play out in front of the entire town. She tried to pull away, but his hold was like iron. "Cain, you're hurting me," she whispered, though her words seemed to echo in the stillness. "Am I?" His smile never wavered, but his eyes were stone cold. "I'm just helping you remember your place, sweetheart. A wife's duty is to her husband, not to every Tom, Dick, and Harry who wants her attention. Let her go." The voice came from behind Cain, quiet, but carrying absolute authority. Knox had moved from his corner near the door, and now stood just a few feet away, his dark eyes fixed on his brother's face with an intensity that made several people take an unconscious step backward. Cain's head turned slowly, his grip on Vivian's wrist tightening further. "This doesn't concern you, little brother. Go back to your corner and mind your own business." I said, "Let her go." Knox's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it, the kind of strength that didn't need to shout to be heard. "Now." For a moment, the two brothers stared at each other, and the entire room held its breath. Vivian could feel the tension crackling between them like electricity before a storm, old grievances and buried resentments rising to the surface. Then Cain's smile widened, taking on a cruel edge. "Or what, Knox? You'll make me?" He laughed, the sound ugly in the silent room. "You couldn't make me do anything when we were children, and you sure as hell can't now." Knox took a step closer, and Vivian saw something in his posture that made her breath catch. Gone was the quiet, unassuming man who faded into the background. In his place stood someone who looked like he could handle himself in any fight, someone who had been holding back more than anyone realized. "Try me," Knox said simply. The two words carried such quiet menace that several women gasped audibly. Cain's eyes widened slightly, as if seeing his brother clearly for the first time in years. For a moment his grip on Vivian's wrist loosened, and she thought the confrontation might end peacefully. Then his pride reasserted itself, and his face twisted with rage. "You think you can threaten me? You think you can take what's mine?" His free hand shot out to grab Vivian's other arm, yanking her against him hard enough to make her cry out. Knox moved like lightning, covering the distance between them in 2 quick strides. His hand closed over Cain's wrist with crushing force, and suddenly Vivian was free, stumbling backward into Mrs. Patterson's steadying arms. "Don't," Knox said, his voice deadly quiet, "ever put your hands on her again." Cain tried to jerk free, but Knox's grip was implacable. The older brother's face went white, then red, as he realized he couldn't break loose. "This is between me and my fiancée," he snarled. "You have no right. She said you were hurting her," Knox interrupted, his dark eyes boring into Cain's. "That gives me every right I need." The standoff stretched for endless seconds, the entire room watching in stunned silence. Finally, Knox released his brother's wrist and stepped back, but his posture remained ready, coiled like a spring. Cain rubbed his wrist, his face a mask of humiliation and fury. "This isn't over," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "You'll regret interfering in my business, Knox. Both of you will." He turned on his heel and stalked toward the door, pausing only to grab his hat from the rack. "The engagement party is Sunday," he called back to Vivian without turning around. "Don't even think about disappointing me again." The door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the windows, and for a long moment nobody moved. Then the whispers started, shocked murmurs and worried conversations that filled the sudden void left by Cain's departure. Vivian stood frozen in the center of it all, her wrist throbbing where the bracelet had cut into her skin. She looked down and saw a thin line of blood where the diamond setting had broken the delicate flesh, and suddenly the full reality of what had just happened hit her like a physical blow. "Vivian?" Knox's voice was gentle now, concerned. "Are you all right?" She looked up to find him standing close enough to touch, his dark eyes filled with a warmth that was the complete opposite of his brother's cold fury. Without thinking, she held out her injured wrist, and he took it in his large, calloused hands with infinite care. "We should clean this," he said, examining the small cut, "and get some ice for the swelling." Vivian started to speak, then found she had no words. Everything she thought she knew about her life, her future, her fiancé, had just shattered like glass on a stone floor. The man she was supposed to marry in 3 weeks had just publicly humiliated and hurt her, and his own brother had been the one to protect her. "Come on," Knox said quietly, placing a protective hand on her back. "Let's get you home." As he guided her toward the door, Vivian caught sight of the diamond bracelet on the floor, where it had fallen when Knox freed her. From Cain's grip, the gems that had seemed so beautiful this morning now looked like shards of ice, cold and sharp and dangerous. She didn't look back as Knox led her out into the night, but she could feel the weight of the town stairs following them. By morning, everyone in Cedar Falls would know what had happened at the church social. They would know that Cain Morrison had shown his true colors, and they would know that quiet Knox Morrison had been the one to stand up to him. What they wouldn't know, what Vivian herself was only beginning to understand, was that her entire world had just shifted on its axis, and there was no going back to the way things were before. The night air was cool against her flushed cheeks as Knox helped her into his wagon, his movements careful and respectful. As they rode through the quiet streets toward her cottage, Vivian found herself stealing glances at the man beside her, really looking at him for perhaps the first time. Knox Morrison wasn't just Cain's quiet younger brother. He was a man in his own right, with his own strength, his own convictions, and his own quiet brand of courage. Tonight, when it mattered most, he had been the one to protect her. The question now was, what was she going to do about it? The ride to Vivian's cottage passed in silence, broken only by the gentle clop of horse hooves on the dirt road and the distant sound of night birds calling to each other across the darkness. Knox kept his eyes on the road ahead, but Vivian was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the careful way he held the reins, the protective set of his shoulders that spoke of a man ready to defend against any threat. When they reached her small white cottage, with its picket fence and climbing roses, Knox helped her down from the wagon with the same careful gentleness he'd shown all evening. His hands were large and work-roughened, but they held her as if she were made of spun glass. "Thank you," she said quietly, not sure if she was thanking him for the ride home or for what he'd done at the church social. Perhaps both. Knox nodded, his hat brim shadowing his eyes. "Will you be all right? I could stay, on the porch, keep watch." The offer was made without presumption, simply a man concerned for a woman's safety. It would have been the practical thing to accept. After Cain's threats, she had no idea what the night might bring. But Vivian found herself shaking her head. "I'll be fine," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Knox, what you did tonight was what any decent man would do," he interrupted quietly. "You don't need to thank me for that." But she did need to thank him, because in her experience, not every man would have stepped in. Not every man would have risked his brother's wrath to protect a woman who wasn't even his to protect. The realization sat heavy in her chest as she watched him climb back into his wagon. "Knox," she called as he gathered the reins. He looked back at her, his dark eyes questioning. "Why did you do it? Really?" For a long moment he was silent, and she thought he might not answer. Then he spoke, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it. "Because you deserve better than that, Vivian. You've always deserved better." Before she could ask what he meant, he clicked to his horse, and the wagon rolled away into the darkness, leaving her standing alone on her front porch with her heart hammering against her ribs and questions swirling through her mind like autumn leaves in a windstorm. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with dreams that made no sense. Cain's cold eyes and Knox's gentle hands, diamond bracelets that cut like chains and wooden horses that galloped away across endless prairies. She woke before dawn, with her wrist still aching and the taste of fear lingering in her mouth. The morning brought Mrs. Patterson to her door, carrying a basket of fresh eggs and wearing the concerned expression of a woman who had seen too much the night before. "How are you feeling, dear?" she asked, setting the basket on Vivian's kitchen table and pulling out a small jar of salve. "I brought something for that wrist." Vivian accepted the kindness gratefully, letting the older woman tend to the thin cut where the bracelet had broken her skin. The salve was cool and soothing, smelling of lavender and calendula. "The whole town's talking," Mrs. Patterson said as she worked. "About what happened last night, about what Cain did, and what Knox did to stop it." "I suppose they are," Vivian said quietly. She had known this morning would bring gossip and speculation, had dreaded it, even as she'd known it was inevitable. "Most folks are saying it's about time someone stood up to Cain Morrison," Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice carefully neutral. "That boy's been getting away with too much for too long, thinking his money and his charm give him the right to treat people however he pleases." Vivian looked up sharply. Has there been trouble before?" Mrs. Patterson's hands stilled. For a moment. "Nothing anyone could prove, mind you, but there've been whispers. Young Mary Sullivan left town awful sudden last year after working as a maid up at the Morrison Ranch. and the Henderson boy came home with bruises after Cain caught him fishing in the creek that borders their property. The words sent a chill down Vivian's spine. She had attributed Cain's behavior the night before to too much drink and wounded pride. But what if it was something more? What if last night hadn't been an aberration, but a glimpse of who he really was when the mask slipped? "What should I do?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Mrs. Patterson finished wrapping her wrist with gentle efficiency, then sat back in her chair. "What does your heart tell you to do?" It was such a simple question, yet it cut straight to the core of her confusion. Her heart was telling her things she wasn't sure she was ready to hear, that safety and love weren't the same thing, that quiet strength might be worth more than loud charm, that the man who had carved her a wooden horse might understand her better than the one who had showered her with diamonds. "I don't know," she admitted. "Everything I thought I knew about Cain, about our future together, it all feels different now." "Then maybe," Mrs. Patterson said gently, "it's time to start listening to what you're seeing instead of what you're being told." The older woman left shortly after, but her words lingered in the quiet cottage like morning mist. Vivian found herself moving through her usual routines, preparing for school, reviewing her lessons, tending her small garden, while her mind churned with questions that had no easy answers. It was mid-morning when Knox appeared at her garden gate, hat in hand, and uncertainty written across his weathered features. He had changed from his good clothes into workwear, denim pants and a cotton shirt rolled up to reveal strong forearms marked with old scars and new scratches from ranch work. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said, his voice carrying that same careful respect she had heard the night before. "I wanted to check on how you're feeling, and to bring you this." He held out a small object wrapped in soft cloth. When Vivian unfolded the fabric, she found herself looking at a simple gold band. Old and worn smooth, but beautiful in its simplicity. "It was my mother's," Knox said quietly. "She died when I was 12, and I've been carrying it ever since. I thought, that is, if you ever need—" He stopped, color rising in his cheeks as he struggled to find the right words. "Knox," Vivian said softly, understanding flooding through her. "What are you asking?" He met her eyes then, and she saw something in them that took her breath away. Not the demanding possession she had grown used to seeing in Cain's gaze, but something infinitely gentler and more precious. "Hope, perhaps, or love that asked for nothing in return. I'm asking if you'd consider marrying me instead," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I know it sounds crazy, and I know you don't love me the way a wife should love a husband, but I can protect you, Vivian. I can give you a life where you're safe and respected and free to be yourself, and I'd never—" His voice broke slightly. "I'd never hurt you the way he did." The offer hung between them like a bridge across a raging river, a way to safety that would require a leap of faith she wasn't sure she was brave enough to make. Marriage to Knox would solve her immediate problem with Cain, but it would also mean binding herself to a man she barely knew, no matter how kind he seemed. "You don't have to answer now," Knox said quickly, seeing her hesitation. "Just think about it, and know that the offer stands, whatever you decide." As he turned to go, Vivian found herself calling after him. "Knox, why? Why would you do this? For me?" He stopped, his back still turned, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet she almost missed it. "Because some things are worth protecting, even if you can't have them for yourself." The words followed her long after he had gone, echoing in her mind as she held his mother's ring up to the light. It was a simple band, unmarked by ostentation or show, but it represented something Cain's expensive gifts never had. Genuine care offered without conditions or expectations. For the first time since accepting Cain's proposal, Vivian found herself seriously considering what it might mean to choose a different path entirely. 3 days passed before Vivian saw Cain again. 3 days during which she found herself jumping at every unexpected sound and checking the locks on her doors twice each night. When he finally appeared, It was at the schoolhouse during the lunch hour, when all the children were outside playing, and she was alone with her thoughts and a pile of arithmetic papers to grade. He entered without knocking, filling the doorway with his presence just as he always had. But something was different. Now, where once she had seen confidence, she now noticed the predatory way his eyes swept the room before settling on her. Where once she had admired his commanding presence, she now felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing pressing down on her shoulders. "Hello, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying that familiar charm, though it sounded forced to her newly sensitized ears. "I've missed you." Vivian set down her pen carefully, buying herself time to think. "Cain, I wasn't expecting you. I know things got a little heated the other night," he continued, moving closer to her desk. "I wanted to apologize for that. I'd had too much to drink, and seeing you refuse me in front of the whole town, well, it wounded my pride more than I'd like to admit. It was an apology of sorts, she supposed, though it seemed to place as much blame on her as on himself. She noticed he didn't mention the bruises on her wrist or the fear she'd seen in the other women's eyes as they watched him lose control. "You hurt me," she said quietly, the words coming out steadier than she'd expected. Cain's expression shifted, becoming more serious. "I know, and I'm sorry for that. I never meant to cause you pain, Vivian. You have to believe that." He rounded her desk, coming to stand beside her chair. "But you have to understand how it looked. My own fiancé defying me in public, making me look like a fool in front of the entire town." There it was again, that subtle shift of responsibility. Somehow, in his version of events, her desire to help with cleanup had become defiance, and his loss of control had become her fault for embarrassing him. "I wasn't trying to defy you," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she wondered why she was defending herself. "I was simply trying to honor a commitment I'd made to my friends. Friends who don't matter more than your future husband," Cain said, his voice taking on that edge she was learning to recognize. "Once we're married, Vivian, you'll need to understand where your priorities lie. A wife's first duty is to her husband's reputation and standing in the community." The word duty sat wrong with her, heavy and cold in the warm afternoon air. Was that really what marriage was supposed to be? A series of duties and obligations, with love somewhere far down the list? "And what about a husband's duty to his wife?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Cain's eyes narrowed slightly. "A husband's duty is to provide and protect, which I've always done and always will do." He reached out to touch her cheek, and she had to force herself not to flinch away. "You're just upset right now, confused by what happened. Once we're married and settled into our proper roles, you'll understand better. Our proper roles." The phrase made her stomach turn. Was her proper role to be silent and compliant, to never question or disagree, to be more ornament than partner? "Cain," she began, then stopped. She'd been about to tell him about Knox's offer, about the doubts that had been growing in her, heart like weeds in an untended garden. But something in his expression warned her that now was not the time for such honesty. "What is it, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice softening. "You can tell me anything." But that wasn't true, was it? She couldn't tell him that his behavior the other night had frightened her, couldn't tell him that she was beginning to question everything about their relationship, couldn't tell him that his own brother had offered her an escape route that was looking more tempting by the hour. "Nothing," she said instead. "I'm just tired, I suppose." Cain studied her face for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through her careful composure. Then he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course you are. Planning a wedding is exhausting work." He glanced around the schoolroom, taking in the children's drawings pinned to the walls and the worn wooden desks that had seen decades of use. "It'll be nice when you can put all this behind you and focus on what really matters." "This?" Vivian followed his gaze, confused. "You mean teaching?" "Well, naturally. A wife doesn't work, Vivian. Her job is managing the household and raising children." He said it as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, as if her years of education, and her love for teaching were just a phase she would outgrow once she took on her proper role. "But I love teaching," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "The children need me, and I'm good at what I do." Something dangerous flickered in Cain's eyes. "Are you saying that a room full of other people's children is more important to you than your own future family? Than being my wife?" The question was a trap, she realized. Any answer she gave would be wrong. Either she didn't care about their future together, or she was selfish for wanting to continue the work that gave her life meaning. "Of course not," she said carefully. "I just hadn't realized that marriage would mean giving up teaching entirely." "Well, now you do." His tone suggested the matter was closed. "The Morrison name carries certain expectations, Vivian. People will be watching to see how well you fulfill your role as my wife." Before she could respond, the sound of children's voices drifted through the open window as they returned from their lunch break. Cain glanced toward the door, then back at her. "I should go," he said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. The gesture should have been tender, but it felt more like a brand of ownership. "I'm having dinner with some business associates tonight, but I'll see you Sunday for our engagement party. Mother's been planning it for weeks." After he left, Vivian sat alone in her classroom, listening to the children's laughter and trying to imagine a life without it. No more young minds to challenge and encourage, no more small victories when a struggling student finally understood a difficult concept. No more sense of purpose beyond managing a household and producing heirs for the Morrison name. It was then that she noticed something on her desk that hadn't been there before. A small, leather-bound journal, worn with age and use. She opened it carefully, and her breath caught as she recognized Knox's careful handwriting filling the pages. The first entry was dated 3 years ago. "Saw Vivian in town today. She was helping old Mrs. Henderson with her packages, laughing at something the old woman said. Her laugh is like music. I wanted to help too, but what right do I have? She deserves better than a man who lives in his brother's shadow." Vivian's hands trembled as she turned the page, finding entry after entry filled with observations about her daily life, worries about her welfare, and expressions of a love so deep and selfless it took her breath away. Cain proposed to her today. "I should be happy for them. She'll have security, a fine house, everything a woman could want. So why does my heart feel like it's breaking? I suppose some dreams aren't meant to come true." Another entry from just 2 weeks ago. She looked sad today at the market. Cain was with her, choosing her purchases, making decisions about what she could and couldn't buy. When did love become about control? When did caring for someone mean taking away their choices? The final entry was dated yesterday. "I gave her mother's ring today. It felt like giving away my heart, but if it can offer her some protection, some way out of a situation that grows more dangerous by the day, then it's worth it. She deserves to choose her own path, even if that path leads away from me." Vivian closed the journal with shaking hands, her vision blurred by unshed tears. Here was a love that asked for nothing, that celebrated her independence rather than trying to control it, that wanted her happiness even at the cost of the giver's own dreams. Cain's visit had clarified one thing with painful certainty. Marriage to him would mean the death of everything that made her who she was. But Knox's journal had shown her something else entirely. That love didn't have to be about possession and control, that it could be about freedom and choice and mutual respect. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, Vivian knew exactly what she needed to do. The only question now was whether she had the courage to do it. The midnight wedding took place in Reverend Murphy's small parlor, lit only by the flickering glow of oil lamps and the silver light of a full moon streaming through lace curtains. Vivian stood in her simple blue dress, the same one she had worn to the church social that now seemed like a lifetime ago, her hands trembling as she held Knox's mother's ring. She had arrived at Knox's cabin just after 11 o'clock, her heart hammering so hard she was certain it could be heard for miles. The decision to come had crystallized suddenly after reading his journal, a moment of perfect clarity, cutting through weeks of confusion and doubt. She couldn't marry Cain, wouldn't condemn herself to a life of silent submission and lost dreams. But more than that, she found herself genuinely wanting to marry Knox, this quiet man who had loved her from afar with such patient devotion. Knox had answered her desperate knock immediately, as if he had been waiting by the door. When she'd told him she wanted to accept his proposal, his dark eyes had filled with something that might have been wonder. "Are you certain?" he had asked quietly. "Once we do this, there's no going back." "Cain will—" "I'm certain," she had interrupted, and meant it with every fibre of her being. Now, as Reverend Murphy spoke the ancient words that would bind them together, Vivian found herself studying her soon-to-be husband's profile in the lamplight. Knox's face was weathered from years of outdoor work, marked with small scars that spoke of a hard life, but there was a gentleness in his features that she had never noticed before. When he spoke his vows, his voice was steady and sure, each word a promise she believed he would keep. "Do you, Vivian Hayes, take Knox Morrison to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" "I do," she whispered, and felt something settle into place in her chest. Not the wild excitement she had expected to feel on her wedding day, but something deeper and more lasting. Peace, perhaps, or the simple comfort of knowing she had made the right choice. Knox slipped his mother's ring onto her finger with hands that barely trembled, and when he lifted her chin to seal their union with a kiss, his touch was so gentle it brought tears to her eyes. This was what love should feel like, she realized, not demanding or possessive, but offering and protective. "You're safe now," he murmured against her forehead after the Reverend had pronounced them husband and wife. "I promise you're safe." They walked back to Knox's cabin in comfortable silence, the night air cool against their faces and the stars bright overhead. Vivian carried a small bag with her few belongings. She had packed light, taking only what she couldn't bear to leave behind. Everything else could be dealt with later, when the storm she had set in motion finally broke. Knox's cabin was modest but clean, built of logs chinked with mud and moss, with a stone fireplace that filled one wall and windows that looked out over rolling pastureland. It was a far cry from the grand house Cain had been planning to build for them, but it felt more like home than any mansion ever could. "I've prepared the bedroom for you," Knox said, his voice carefully neutral as he gestured toward a door at the back of the cabin. "I'll sleep on the cot by the fire until you're ready for other arrangements." The consideration in his words, the lack of assumption or demand, was so different from what she had grown to expect that it nearly undid her composure entirely. Cain would have considered her body his right from the moment the vows were spoken, but Knox was offering her time and choice even in this most intimate of matters. "Knox," she began, then stopped, not sure how to express what she was feeling. Gratitude seemed too small a word for what he had given her, not just safety, but the freedom to remain herself. "You don't need to say anything," he said gently. "Just rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." He was right about that. By morning, all of Cedar Falls would know about their midnight marriage. Cain would know, and his rage would be terrible to behold. But tonight, in this small cabin that smelled of wood smoke and leather, she felt truly safe for the first time in weeks. Vivian lay awake for a long time in the narrow bed that had belonged to Knox's parents, listening to the night sounds beyond. The walls, an owl calling from the oak tree by the creek, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft whisper of wind through the grass. Through the thin walls, she could hear Knox moving quietly around the main room, banking the fire and checking the locks on the doors. When she finally slept, she dreamed not of diamond bracelets or grand houses, but of wooden horses galloping across endless prairies under starlit skies. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon and the sound of Knox's voice speaking quietly to someone outside. Panic fluttered in her chest as she recognized the second voice. It was Sheriff Brennan, and he sounded grim. Vivian dressed quickly and emerged from the bedroom to find Knox standing in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking most of her view. Of the sheriff beyond! Both men turned when they heard her footstep, and she saw something in their faces that made her stomach clench with dread. "What's wrong?" she asked, though part of her already knew. Sheriff Brennan, a grizzled man in his 50s who had known her since childhood, removed his hat and nodded respectfully. "Morning, Mrs. Morrison. I'm sorry to disturb you so early, but I thought you should know. Your cottage burned down last night." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Burned down? How?" The sheriff's eyes flicked to Knox, then back to her. "Hard to say for certain. Could have been an accident. A lamp left burning, embers from the fireplace. But the thing is, it happened just a few hours after folks started talking about your marriage to Knox here." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Vivian sank into one of Knox's handmade chairs, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her. "Do you think... was it Cain?" "I can't prove anything," Sheriff Brennan said carefully. "But I'd be lying if I said the timing wasn't suspicious. Your neighbor, Mrs. Fletcher, said she saw a rider near your place around midnight, but it was too dark to make out who it was." Knox moved to stand behind Vivian's chair, his hands coming to rest gently on her shoulders. She could feel the tension in his touch, the barely controlled anger at this latest cruelty. "Everything I owned," she whispered, thinking of her mother's china, her father's books, the small mementos that had connected her to a family long gone. All of it reduced to ash and smoke. "Not everything," Knox said quietly. "You're safe. That's what matters." Sheriff Brennan cleared his throat. "There's something else you should know. Cain's been asking questions around town this morning, wanting to know who performed the ceremony, who witnessed it, whether it was legal. He's also been making some pretty wild accusations about Knox forcing you into this marriage." Vivian's head snapped up. "That's not true. I came to Knox of my own free will. I asked him to marry me." "I believe you," the sheriff said, "but Cain's got influence in this town, and money talks. You might want to be prepared for some difficult days ahead." After the sheriff left, Vivian and Knox sat in silence for a long time, the reality of their situation settling around them like a heavy blanket. She had known there would be consequences for defying Cain Morrison, but she hadn't imagined he would strike so quickly or so cruelly. "I'm sorry," Knox said finally, "about your things, your cottage. If I had thought he would—" "You couldn't have known," Vivian interrupted, "and even if you had, it wouldn't have changed anything. I couldn't marry him, Knox. I wouldn't have been able to live with myself." He turned to look at her then, his dark eyes serious. "Do you regret it? Coming here? Marrying me?" The question deserved an honest answer. Vivian thought about her cottage, in ashes, about the difficult days Sheriff Brennan had warned them to expect, about the life she had left behind in the space of a single night. Then she thought about Knox's gentle hands and patient love, about the freedom to make her own choices and speak her own mind. "No," she said, and meant it completely. "I don't regret it at all." Something shifted in Knox's expression. Relief, perhaps, or gratitude. He reached out tentatively, and when she didn't pull away, he took her hand in his large, calloused one. "Then we'll face whatever comes," he said simply. "Together." Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, dark and threatening. But inside the small cabin, sitting beside the man who had given her back her freedom, Vivian felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. The first weeks of their marriage settled into a rhythm that surprised Vivian with its gentle ease. Knox rose before dawn to tend the cattle and horses, moving through his morning chores with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been caring for the land most of his life. She would wake to the sound of him splitting wood or drawing water from the well, domestic sounds that spoke of security and continuity. They shared breakfast in comfortable silence most mornings, Knox reading the week-old newspaper that came with the mail wagon while Vivian planned her lessons for the day. To her immense relief, he had never suggested she give up teaching. Quite the opposite, in fact. When she had mentioned her concern about the long walk to the schoolhouse, he had quietly arranged for her to use one of his horses, a gentle mare named Penny, who seemed to understand her rider's inexperience with infinite patience. It was on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into their marriage, that Vivian first saw the scar. Knox had been chopping wood behind the cabin when the axe handle, weakened by years of use, finally snapped. The broken wood caught him across the ribs, not seriously but hard enough to tear his shirt and reopen what looked like an old wound. Vivian had been hanging laundry when she heard his sharp intake of breath, and she hurried around the corner to find him examining the damage. "It's nothing," he said when he saw her approach, but she could see blood seeping through the torn fabric. "Let me see," she said, her teacher's voice brooking no argument. Knox hesitated, then pulled off the ruined shirt with obvious reluctance. The scar that ran along his left side was clearly old but extensive, a jagged star-shaped mark that spoke of violence and pain. Around it were smaller scars, some clearly from knife wounds, others that looked like they might have come from a whip or belt. Vivian's breath caught as she realized what she was seeing. "Who did this to you?" she asked quietly. Though part of her already knew the answer, Knox's jaw tightened. It doesn't matter, it was a long time ago. But it did matter, because suddenly so many things made sense. The way he moved sometimes, as if expecting a blow, the careful distance he kept from his brother, the protective instincts that had driven him to interfere at the church social. Despite the personal cost. "Cain," she said, and it wasn't a question. Knox was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Among others, Cain was older, stronger. He learned early that father rewarded strength and punished weakness, and I was always the weaker one." "You're not weak," Vivian said fiercely, surprising them both with her vehemence. "What happened to you? That wasn't weakness. That was survival." She went into the cabin and returned with clean water and bandages, tending to the reopened wound with gentle hands. Knox stood perfectly still under her ministrations, but she could feel the tension in his muscles, could see the way his breathing had become carefully controlled. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "I can tend it myself." "I know, I don't have to," Vivian replied, cleaning the cut with careful strokes. "I want to." Something in her tone made him look down at her, and for a moment their eyes met and held. She saw surprise there, and something deeper, a vulnerability that he quickly shuttered away. "Why?" he asked. The question was simple, but the answer was complicated. Because she was beginning to understand that strength came in many forms, and the man who had endured years of abuse and still managed to remain gentle was stronger than any bully who used his fists to get his way. Because she was starting to see that the quiet love he had offered her was more precious than all of Cain's grand gestures. Because somewhere in the past weeks, between shared breakfasts and comfortable silences, she had begun to care for him. In ways that had nothing to do with gratitude or convenience. "Because you matter," she said simply, and watched something shift in his expression. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Knox immediately stepped in front of Vivian, his posture shifting into something alert and protective, and she felt her stomach clench with familiar dread. Through the trees that surrounded the cabin, she could see riders approaching, 3 of them, and even at a distance she recognized the commanding figure in the lead. Cain had come calling. "Go inside," Knox said quietly, his voice carrying an authority she had never heard from him before. "No," Vivian said, stepping up beside him. "We face this together." Knox started to protest, then seemed to see something in her expression that changed his mind. He nodded once, then reached for the shirt she had brought outside for him to change into. As he pulled it on, she noticed the way his movements had changed. Less of the gentle rancher, more of the man who had faced down his brother at the church. Social Cain rode up to the cabin with Sheriff Brennan and a man Vivian didn't recognize, someone with the hard look of a hired gun. All 3 dismounted, but only Cain approached the porch, where Knox and Vivian stood waiting. "Brother," Cain said, his voice carrying that familiar charm, though his eyes were cold as winter stone. "Vivian, I thought it was time we had a talk." "About what?" Knox replied, his tone carefully neutral. "About this mockery of a marriage, for starters." Cain's gaze fixed on Vivian, and she felt the familiar chill of his attention. "About how you stole my fiancée in the middle of the night like some common thief." "I didn't steal anything," Knox said quietly. "Vivian came to me of her own free will." Cain's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Of her own free will, please. We both know how persuasive you can be when you want something, Knox, how good you are at playing the wounded victim to gain sympathy." "That's not what happened," Vivian said, finding her voice. "Knox never pressured me. I asked him to marry me because I couldn't—" She stopped herself before saying too much, but Cain's expression suggested he understood perfectly. "Because you couldn't what, sweetheart?" The endearment was spoken like a curse. "Because you couldn't handle being married to a real man? Because you preferred someone you could control?" "Because I couldn't marry someone who would hurt me," Vivian said, the words coming out stronger than she felt. "Someone who saw me as property instead of a person." For a moment, Cain's mask slipped completely, and she saw the cold fury underneath. Then he smiled, and somehow that was even more frightening. "I see Knox has been filling your head with stories," he said. "Lies about our childhood, about things he doesn't understand. He always was good at twisting the truth to make himself look sympathetic." "The scars on his body aren't lies," Vivian said, and watched Cain's eyes narrow. "Scars he earned through his own stupidity and defiance," Cain replied smoothly. "A boy who won't learn has to be taught one way or another." The casual way he dismissed years of abuse, the complete lack of remorse in his voice, confirmed everything. Vivian had begun to suspect about the man she had almost married. This was who Cain Morrison really was, not the charming suitor who had courted her with flowers and pretty words, but a man who saw violence as a tool and cruelty as his right. "Get off my land," Knox said quietly, but his voice carried the kind of authority that made the hired gunman's hand drift toward his weapon. "Your land?" Cain laughed. "This pathetic little plot? Knox, you're forgetting who holds the deed to the family ranch, who controls the water rights that keep your cattle alive. Cross me, and you'll find out just how quickly things can change." Around here, the threat hung in the air like smoke, and Vivian saw Knox's hands clench into fists at his sides. But when he spoke, his voice remained steady. "Maybe. But right now you're trespassing, and Sheriff Brennan there knows it as well as I do." All eyes turned to the sheriff, who looked distinctly uncomfortable with his position. "Cain, you've said your piece. Maybe it's time to go." For a moment, Vivian thought Cain might refuse. His hand had moved to rest on the butt of his pistol, and there was something in his posture that spoke of violence barely held in check. Then he smiled again, that cold, calculating expression that chilled her to the bone. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I wouldn't want to overstay my welcome. But Knox, dear brother," his voice dropped to a tone that was somehow more threatening than any shout. "This isn't over, not by a long shot." As the three men mounted their horses and rode away, Vivian felt Knox's hand find hers. His fingers were steady, but she could feel the tension thrumming through him like a tightly wound spring. "He won't give up," she said quietly. "No," Knox agreed. "He won't, but neither will I." The promise in his words, the quiet determination, should have comforted her. Instead, watching the dust cloud kicked up by Cain's departure, Vivian couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was only just beginning. And this time, she was afraid that love and right might not be enough to protect them from the storm that was coming. The discovery came by accident, as the most important revelations often do. Vivian had been helping Knox repair a section of fence damaged in the previous night's storm when her horse Penny threw a shoe. Leading the mare back toward the cabin, they took a shortcut through an old grove of cottonwoods that bordered the creek, separating Knox's small holding from the main Morrison ranch. It was there, half buried under fallen leaves and storm debris, that Knox's boot caught on something. hard and unyielding. He knelt to investigate, brushing away the accumulated detritus to reveal a corner of oiled leather poking through the soil. "What is it?" Vivian asked, tethering Penny to a nearby tree. Knox's expression was puzzled as he worked to free the object from its muddy grave. "Looks like a saddlebag. Been here a while by the look of it." The leather was water-stained and cracked with age, but the buckles were still intact. When he lifted it free, it was heavier than expected. "Probably lost by some passing rider," Vivian suggested, but Knox was shaking his head. "No," he said slowly, examining the distinctive tooled pattern on the leather. "I know this bag. It belonged to Samuel Garrett." His voice had taken on an odd quality, part recognition and part something darker. "He disappeared 2 years ago. Right after he started asking questions about his property deed." Vivian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Samuel Garrett, wasn't he the one who claimed Cain had cheated him out of his land?" Knox nodded grimly. "Everyone said he was just a bitter old man who couldn't accept that he'd lost his ranch fair and square. But Samuel was sharp as a tack, and he knew every inch of his property. He wouldn't have signed anything unless—" He stopped, his fingers working at the saddlebag's closure. The contents spilled out onto the damp ground like accusations given form. Papers, dozens of them, carefully wrapped in another layer of oiled cloth. Legal documents, deeds, correspondence, and as Knox and Vivian examined them with growing horror, a pattern emerged that turned Vivian's blood to ice water. "Dear God," she whispered, holding up a sheet covered in Cain's familiar handwriting. "Knox, look at this." It was a letter dated 3 months before Samuel Garrett's disappearance, addressed to a lawyer in the territorial capital. In it, Cain detailed a plan to forge a new deed for the Garrett property, backdating it to make it appear that Samuel's father had sold the land to the Morrison family years earlier. The original deed, Cain wrote, would be destroyed, and Samuel would have no legal recourse. "There are more," Knox said, his voice hollow as he sorted through the papers. "The Henderson place, the Fletcher farm, the old Williams homestead, all of them properties that mysteriously became available when the families couldn't prove their ownership anymore." Document after document painted the same ugly picture. Cain Morrison hadn't built his empire through shrewd business dealings and fair negotiations. He had built it on fraud, forgery, and theft, systematically stealing land from families who had worked it for generations. When the legal theft didn't work quickly enough, other methods had been employed. Burned crops, poisoned wells, accidents that befell anyone who asked too many questions. "This letter," Vivian said, her hands shaking as she held up another piece of evidence. "It's to someone named Dutch Van Horn. Cain is asking him to handle the Garrett problem permanently because Samuel was getting too close to the truth." Knox's face had gone ashen. Dutch Van Horn was a name whispered in saloons and spoken of only in hushed tones, a man who hired out his gun to anyone willing to pay his price. If Cain had employed him to deal with Samuel Garrett, then the missing rancher wasn't missing at all. He was dead. "How many?" Vivian asked quietly. "How many people has he killed for their land?" Knox continued sorting through the papers, his movements mechanical as the full scope of his brother's crimes became clear. "At least 6 that I can count, maybe more." He held up a map marked with red X's, each one corresponding to a property that had mysteriously changed hands. All of them questioned their deeds. All of them disappeared or died in accidents before they could take their cases to court. The implications hit Vivian like a physical blow. She had known Cain was controlling and possessive, had seen glimpses of his capacity for violence, but this was something else entirely. This was systematic murder for profit, carried out over years with careful planning and ruthless efficiency. "We have to take this to Sheriff Brennan," she said, but Knox was already shaking his head. "Brennan's been bought," he said quietly. "Has been for years. Why do you think none of these disappearances were ever properly investigated?" Why no one ever looked too hard at Cain's rapid acquisition of properties. He gestured to another letter, this one detailing payments made to various local officials. Half the territorial government is in his pocket. Vivian sank down onto a fallen log, the weight of their discovery crushing down on her like a physical thing. Then what do? We can't just let him keep killing people. Knox was quiet for a long moment, staring at the damning evidence spread out before them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a resolution she had never heard from him before. "We stop him," he said simply. "Whatever it takes, we stop him. How? If the law won't help us, then we make our own justice." Knox's dark eyes met hers, and she saw something in them that was both frightening and inspiring. The quiet, gentle man she had married was still there, but underneath was steel, tempered by years of abuse and sharpened by righteous anger. "These papers are evidence, Vivian, real evidence of what he's done. There are federal marshals in the territorial capital, men who can't be bought with Cain's money. If we can get this to them—" "He'll kill us first," Vivian interrupted. "The moment he realizes what we've found, he'll do to us what he did to Samuel Garrett and all the others." Knox nodded grimly. "Probably. But what's the alternative? Let him keep stealing and killing until he owns half the territory. Let him get away with murder because we're too frightened to stop him." The questions hung between them like a challenge, and Vivian found herself thinking of all the families who had lost everything to Cain's greed. The Hendersons, who were about to lose their home because they couldn't prove ownership of land their family had worked for 3 generations. Little Thomas Henderson, who would grow up knowing his family had been robbed of their legacy. All the other children who would never know their fathers because Cain Morrison had decided their lives were worth less than property deeds. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, and saw something shift in Knox's expression, surprise, perhaps, or admiration. "Are you sure? If we do this, there's no going back. Cain will know we're working against him, and he won't hesitate to... What, kill me?" Vivian laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Knox, I was going to marry him. I was going to share his bed, bear his children, spend my life helping him maintain the fiction that he's a respectable man. If these papers are accurate, I would have been an accessory to murder simply by being his wife." She stood up, brushing off her skirts with hands that were steadier than she felt. "Besides, someone needs to speak for the people he's killed. Someone needs to make sure Samuel Garrett and all the others didn't die for nothing." Knox gathered the papers carefully, wrapping them back in their oiled cloth protection. "We'll need to be smart about this. Careful, Cain can't suspect what we know until we're ready to act." "How long do we have?" "Not long," Knox admitted. "That storm last night washed out a section of creek bank. If Cain decides to ride this way, if he sees the disturbed ground where we found the saddlebag—" He shook his head. "We need to move quickly." As they walked back toward the cabin, Vivian found herself looking at the familiar landscape with new eyes. Every grove of trees might hide another grave. Every suspicious accident might be another murder. Cain Morrison had turned their entire corner of the territory into his personal kingdom, built on the bones of anyone who dared to challenge him. But now they knew the truth. Now they had evidence. And despite the fear that gnawed at her stomach, like hunger, Vivian felt something else rising within her, a fierce determination to see justice done, no matter the cost. "Knox," she said as they reached the cabin, "when this is over, when Cain is brought to justice, what happens to us?" He turned to look at her, his dark eyes serious. "What do you mean?" "I mean our marriage. It started as a way to protect me from Cain, but if he's no longer a threat—" She found herself unable to finish the question, afraid of what his answer might be. Knox was quiet for a long moment, then reached out to take her hand. "Vivian, I want you to know, whatever happens, whatever you decide about our future together, I'll never regret marrying you. Even if it was only for a few weeks, even if you decide to leave when this is all over, I'll always be grateful for the time we had." The words should have comforted her, but instead they filled her with an unexpected sense of loss. Somewhere in the past weeks, between shared breakfasts and comfortable silences, between tending his wounds and accepting his protection, she had begun to think of this marriage as more than just a convenient arrangement. But that was a question for another day. Right now they had a killer to stop and justice to serve. Everything else would have to wait. "Come on," she said, squeezing his hand. "We have work to do." Knox's father's gun lay on the kitchen table between them like a sleeping serpent, its blue-black steel gleaming dully in the lamplight. Vivian stared at it with a mixture of fascination and revulsion, knowing what it represented. The possibility of violence, the crossing of a line from which there would be no return. "I swore I'd never touch it again," Knox said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of old pain. "After Father died, after I realized I was finally free of his fists and his rage, I put it away and promised myself I'd find another way to solve problems." "And you have," Vivian replied, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "For years you've found other ways, but this isn't about choosing violence, Knox. This is about protecting innocent people from a man who has already chosen it." The past 3 days had been a whirlwind of careful planning and growing tension. They had spent hours poring over Samuel Garrett's hidden documents, organizing them into an irrefutable case against Cain. Knox had ridden to the territorial capital under cover of darkness, leaving the evidence with Federal Marshal Thomas Hawthorne, a man whose reputation for honesty was legendary throughout the territory. The marshal had promised to return within a week with federal warrants and enough men to arrest Cain Morrison and his associates. But as Knox had feared, word of his trip had somehow leaked back to Cedar Falls. Yesterday, they had received a visit from Deputy Patterson, Sheriff Brennan's nephew, and one of the men whose name appeared on Cain's payroll, asking pointed questions about Knox's recent travels. "He knows," Knox had said after the deputy left, his face grim. "Cain knows we've found something, and he knows we've taken it to the authorities. He'll move against us before the marshal can return." Now, as the sun set on what might be their last peaceful evening, they faced the reality that they would likely have to defend themselves before help could arrive. Knox had checked and rechecked every door and window, had positioned weapons strategically. Throughout the cabin, had even prepared an escape route through the root cellar that led to the creek bank. "Are you frightened?" Vivian asked, surprised by how calm her own voice sounded. Knox considered the question seriously, as he did everything. "Yes," he said finally, "but not of dying, if that's what you mean. I'm frightened of failing, of letting Cain win, of allowing him to keep hurting innocent people because I wasn't strong enough to stop him." "You're the strongest man I know," Vivian said, meaning every word. "Not because you can shoot or fight, but because you've survived years of cruelty and somehow managed to remain kind. That takes a strength most people never even develop." Knox's dark eyes met hers across the table, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch. Not just gratitude or affection, but something deeper and more powerful, love perhaps, though neither of them had spoken the word aloud. "Vivian," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with whatever he wanted to say. "If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you," she interrupted fiercely. "We're going to get through this together, just like we've gotten through everything else. But if it does," he persisted gently, "I want you to know these past weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. Not because of what you've done for me, but because of who you are. Your courage, your kindness, the way you see the good in people even when they can't see it themselves." The words hung between them like a bridge, an invitation to cross into deeper waters. Vivian felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized that somewhere along the way, her feelings for this quiet, gentle man had transformed from gratitude into something much more profound. "Knox," she said softly, the sound of approaching horses cut through the night air like a blade, multiple riders moving fast toward the cabin. Knox was on his feet instantly, the gun in his hand with a speed that spoke of old training and older fears. "How many?" Vivian asked, moving to the window and peering through a gap in the curtains. 6, maybe 7, Knox replied, checking the loads in his weapon. Too many for a social call. He looked at her seriously. Vivian, there's still time for you to get to the root cellar, to follow the tunnel to the creek. You could be miles away before— No, she said firmly. I'm not leaving you to face this alone. You don't understand, Knox said urgently. If Cain takes me alive, if he gets his hands on me, what he'll do won't be quick or clean, and if he thinks you know what we know, then we make sure he doesn't take either of us alive. Vivian interrupted, surprising them both with her vehemence. She moved to the fireplace and took down the shotgun Knox had shown her how to use, checking the loads as he had taught her. You said it yourself, we stop him, whatever it takes. The riders were close enough now that they could hear individual voices, Cain's commanding tone rising above the others as he issued orders. Knox positioned himself by the front window while Vivian took the back, both of them staying low and out of sight. Knox Morrison! Cain's voice boomed across the night air. I know you're in there, brother. Come out and let's talk like civilized men. Knox said nothing, but Vivian could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands had tightened on his weapon. Years of conditioning were warring with his newfound resolve. The frightened boy who had learned to submit to his brother's will, battling the man who had finally found something worth fighting for. I know what you found, Cain continued, his tone becoming more menacing. Old Samuel was always too clever for his own good, hiding evidence where he thought no one would look. But thunder and lightning have a way of washing secrets to the surface. Don't they? A shot rang out, shattering the front window and sending glass cascading to the floor. Knox rolled away from the opening, coming up in a crouch with his gun trained on the darkness beyond. That was just to get your attention, Cain called out. The next one won't be a warning. Send out my wife, Knox. This is between you and me. She doesn't need to get hurt. I'm not your wife, Vivian shouted back, her voice carrying clearly in the night air. I never was, and I never will be. The silence that followed was somehow more ominous than the gunshot had been. When Cain spoke again, his voice had taken on a quality that made her skin crawl, cold, calculating, and utterly without mercy. Is that so? Well then, Mrs. Morrison, I suppose you've chosen your side. Pity. I had hoped we could resolve this without too much unpleasantness. Another shot, this one aimed at the back window where Vivian crouched. The bullet splintered the wooden frame, inches from her head, and she realized with crystal clarity that this was no longer about intimidation or negotiation. Cain had come to kill them both. There are 7 of them. Knox said quietly, his eyes scanning the darkness. They've surrounded the cabin. Classic military formation. Father taught it to both of us when we were boys. What do we do? Knox was quiet for a moment, and she could almost see him thinking, weighing their options against the odds. When he spoke, his voice carried a calm authority that reminded her of the man who had faced down his brother at the church social. We make them come to us, he said. Force them to attack on our terms, not theirs. This cabin was built to last. Thick log walls, small windows, only 2 ways in. If we can hold them off until dawn, maybe someone in town will hear the shooting and investigate. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than surrender. Vivian checked her shotgun again, making sure she had extra shells within easy reach. Strange how calm she felt, as if this moment of ultimate crisis had stripped away all her fears and doubts, leaving only a clear sense of purpose. Knox, she said quietly, and when he looked at her, she saw her own resolve reflected in his dark eyes. Whatever happens, I want you to know I love you, not because you saved me from Cain, not because you gave me a way out, but because of who you are. The man who carves wooden horses for children, who tends wounded cattle with gentle hands, who has never raised his voice in anger, despite having every reason to be angry at the world. Something shifted in Knox's expression, a transformation so complete it was like watching a different man emerge from within the familiar shell. The frightened boy, who had learned to hide in shadows, was gone, replaced by someone who looked like He could face down an army if necessary. "I love you too," he said simply, "more than I ever thought possible. And I promise you, Vivian, whatever else happens tonight, Cain Morrison will never hurt you again." Outside, they could hear movement. In the darkness, the soft sound of men positioning themselves for an assault. Soon, very soon, the killing would begin. But here in this small cabin that had become their sanctuary, surrounded by the evidence of lives peacefully lived and quietly shared, Vivian felt something she hadn't expected to feel in the face of almost certain death. Peace. Not the peace of resignation, but the peace that comes from knowing you've chosen the right side, the right fight, the right person to stand with when the darkness closes in. "Are you ready?" Knox asked, and she nodded. "Together?" she said. "Together," he agreed, and then the real battle began. The assault came with the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood, as Cain's men tried to force entry through both the front and back doors simultaneously. Knox's first shot dropped the man trying to break down the front door, the boom of his pistol echoing through the cabin like thunder. Vivian's shotgun roared a moment later, the blast catching another attacker in the shoulder and spinning him away from the back window. "They're trying to flank us," Knox called out, moving to cover the side window, as muzzle flashes lit up the darkness beyond. Two men circling around to the east side. The battle settled into a deadly rhythm. Brief exchanges of gunfire punctuated by tense moments of reloading and repositioning. The thick log walls of the cabin provided excellent protection, but Vivian could hear bullets thudding into the wood with increasing frequency as Cain's men found their range. A burning arrow shattered the front window, embedding itself in the wooden floor near the fireplace. Knox stamped it out quickly, but the message was clear. If they couldn't be shot out, they would be burned out. "The barn," Vivian said, pointing toward the orange glow that was beginning to illuminate the night sky. "They've set the barn on fire." Knox's jaw tightened as he watched months of stored hay and feed go up in flames. The fire would spread to the cabin within minutes if the wind shifted, and from the way the flames were dancing, it looked like the wind was doing exactly that. "We can't stay here," he said grimly. "They're going to smoke us out one way or another." Another burning arrow crashed through the back window, this one landing dangerously close to the ammunition Knox had stored under the kitchen table. As he moved to stamp it out, a rifle cracked from the darkness, and the bullet caught him in the left shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the wall. "Knox!" Vivian scrambled toward him, but he waved her back toward her position. "I'm all right," he said through gritted teeth, though she could see blood spreading across his shirt. "Just a graze." But it wasn't just a graze, and they both knew it. His left arm hung useless at his side, and his face had gone pale with shock and blood loss. The odds, already heavily against them, had just gotten worse. "There's another way," Knox said quietly, his eyes fixed on something beyond the burning barn. "The old mine shaft, about 200 yards east of here. If we can reach it—" "We'd have to cross open ground," Vivian protested. "They'd cut us down before we made it halfway." Knox's smile was grim but determined. "Not if we give them something else to worry about." He gestured toward the kerosene lamp on the kitchen table. "That barn's going to collapse soon. When it does, it'll create enough smoke and confusion to cover our escape, if we time it right." Outside, Cain's voice rose above the crackle of flames. "You're running out of time, brother. Come out now and I'll make it quick. Keep hiding like a coward, and I'll make sure you watch me kill your wife before I put you down like the dog you are." The words sent a surge of anger through Vivian, so pure and hot it surprised her. How dare he threaten Knox, this good man who had never hurt anyone, who had spent his life trying to make amends for violence he hadn't even committed. How dare he reduce their love to something sordid and shameful? He's afraid, she realized suddenly. All this bluster and threatening. He's afraid because he knows the federal marshals are coming. He knows his time is running out. Knox nodded, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounded shoulder. That's why he's taking risks, making mistakes. In his arrogance, he brought too many men, made too much noise. People in town will have heard the shooting by now." As if summoned by his words, the distant sound of church bells began to ring across the night air, the signal Cedar Falls used to call for help in times of crisis. Sheriff Brennan might be corrupt, but there were good men in town who would answer. "That call, regardless of who was paying whom, we just have to hold out a little longer," Knox said, checking the loads in his pistol. "Keep them from overrunning us until help arrives." But even as he spoke, they could hear Cain shouting new orders to his men, organizing them for a final assault. The barn was fully engulfed now, the flames reaching toward the night sky like grasping fingers, and the heat was becoming unbearable even at a distance. "There," Knox said, pointing toward the collapsing structure. "When the roof falls, that's our chance." The barn roof gave way, with a sound like the world ending, sending a column of sparks and smoke spiraling into the darkness. In the chaos that followed, men shouting, horses screaming, the roar of unchecked flames, Knox grabbed Vivian's hand and they ran for their lives into the burning night. Behind them, Cain's voice rose in a howl of frustrated rage that seemed to echo from the very depths of hell itself. They almost made it to the mine shaft. Knox's wounded shoulder slowed them down just enough for Cain's hired gun, Dutch Van Horn, to circle around and cut off their escape route. The killer emerged from the shadows like a nightmare made flesh, his pistol trained on Knox's chest and a cold smile playing around his lips. "That's far enough," he said, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a man who had killed too many times to count. "Mr. Morrison wants a word with you both." Knox stepped protectively in front of Vivian, his own gun steady despite his wounded arm. "Let her go, Dutch. Your quarrel is with me." Dutch laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "My quarrel is with whoever pays me, and right now that's your brother. Though I have to say, I'm looking forward to this job more than most. You've caused Mr. Morrison considerable embarrassment." The standoff stretched between them like a taut wire. Two men with guns pointed at each other, while the barn burned behind them and cast dancing shadows across the ground. Vivian could hear Cain and his remaining men approaching, their voices growing louder as they closed the distance. "You don't have to do this," Knox said quietly. "The federal marshals are coming. When they arrive, they'll have evidence of everything Cain has done. Every murder, every theft, every crime will be blamed on a dead man." Dutch interrupted. "Amazing how talkative witnesses become when the alternative is joining their friends in the ground." That was when Vivian saw it, the glint of metal in the shadows behind Dutch Van Horn. Someone else was moving through the darkness, someone the killer hadn't noticed in his focus on Knox and herself. "Besides," Dutch continued, "I've got too much invested in this territory to let some federal marshal—" The shotgun blast cut off his words permanently. Dutch pitched forward into the dirt, his weapon spinning away into the darkness, while behind him a familiar figure emerged into the firelight. "Federal Marshal Thomas Hawthorne," the man announced, reloading his weapon with practiced efficiency. "And you're all under arrest." The next few minutes passed in a blur of shouted orders and controlled chaos. The marshal had brought 12 men with him, arriving just in time to surround Cain's remaining forces. Most of the hired guns threw down their weapons immediately when faced with federal authority, but Cain himself seemed to have vanished into the smoke and shadows. "Where is he?" Marshal Hawthorne demanded, pressing a field dressing to Knox's wounded shoulder. "Where's Cain Morrison?" Knox's face was pale but determined. "He won't run far. This is his kingdom. He'd rather die defending it than live in exile." As if summoned by the words, Cain's voice echoed across the burning landscape, coming from the direction of the family cemetery where 3 generations of Morrisons lay buried. "Knox! Little brother, if you want to end this, come and end it like a man." The challenge hung in the air like smoke, and Vivian felt Knox tense beside her. She could see the war playing out behind his eyes, years of conditioning that told him to submit to his older brother's will, fighting against his newfound resolve to protect the people he loved. "Don't," she said quietly, her hand finding his. "An injured arm. The marshals can handle him now. You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Knox said, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised them both. "This started between Cain and me, and it needs to end the same way. If I don't face him now, if I let someone else settle this for me, I'll never be free of him. Neither of us will." Marshal Hawthorne started to object, but Knox cut him off with a look that brooked no argument. "Give me 5 minutes," he said. "Then come collect the body, his or mine." The walk to the cemetery felt like the longest of Knox's life. Each step carried him further from the frightened boy who had learned to hide from his brother's fists and closer to the man he had been meant to become. Behind him, he could feel Vivian's eyes watching, could draw strength from her unwavering faith in him. Cain waited among the headstones like an avenging angel, his pistol gleaming in the firelight and his face twisted with years of accumulated rage. When he saw Knox approaching, his lips curved in that familiar mocking smile. "Finally decided to face me like a man?" he sneered. "I was beginning to think you'd hide behind your wife's skirts forever." Knox stopped 10 paces away, his hand resting on the butt of his father's gun. "It's over, Cain. The marshals have the evidence. They've arrested your men. It's finished." "Nothing's finished until I say it's finished," Cain snarled. "I built this empire from nothing, and I'm not about to let some weak-minded fool tear it down because he grew a conscience." The brothers faced each other across the graves of their ancestors, 2 men who had shared a childhood but chosen very different paths. When Cain's hand moved toward his weapon, Knox was ready. The 2 shots echoed across the burning landscape simultaneously, but only one man remained standing when the smoke cleared. Cain Morrison's reign of terror was finally over, ended by the brother he had tormented for so many years, and clutched in his cooling fingers was his grandfather's pocket watch, the hands frozen forever at the moment of his death. 6 months later, Vivian stood in the doorway of the new schoolhouse, watching Knox put the finishing touches on the hand-carved sign that would hang above the entrance. "Cedar Falls Community School," it read in his careful, precise lettering. "Knowledge is the foundation of freedom." The new building was larger than the old one, with tall windows that let in plenty of light and a separate room for the older children. It had been built with money recovered from Cain's fraudulent land deals, money that Marshal Hawthorne had insisted should go back to the community that had suffered under his reign of terror. "Almost finished," Knox said, stepping back to admire his work. His left shoulder still ached sometimes, especially when the weather changed, but the wound had healed cleanly and his strength had returned. More importantly, the shadows that had haunted his eyes for so many years had finally lifted, replaced by a quiet contentment that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. "It's beautiful," Vivian said, meaning every word, like everything Knox created. The sign was both functional and artistic, built to last, but crafted with an attention to detail that spoke of pride in good work. "The children are going to love it." The children. There were more of them now than there had been before. Families that had fled the territory during Cain's brutal reign were beginning to return, bringing their children and their hopes for a better future. The Henderson family had reclaimed their farm, little Thomas proudly showing off the improved grades that had earned him a spot in the advanced reading group. The Fletcher homestead was being rebuilt, and old Mrs. Williams had returned from back east to reclaim the property her husband had been murdered for. It was a new beginning for all of them, but especially for Knox and Vivian. Their marriage, which had begun as a desperate arrangement born of necessity, had transformed into something neither of them had dared to hope for. A partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and a love that grew stronger with each challenge they faced together. "The federal court hearing went well?" Knox asked, settling beside her on the schoolhouse steps. Vivian nodded, thinking of the morning she had spent in the territorial capital, testifying at the trial of Sheriff Brennan and the other officials, who had taken Cain's money in exchange for their silence. Judge Harrison said it was one of the most comprehensive cases of corruption he'd ever seen, Brennan got 20 years, and Deputy Patterson got 10. Good, Knox said quietly. They earned every day of it. The afternoon sun slanted through the cottonwood trees, painting the ground in dappled patterns of light and shadow. In the distance, they could see the workers putting the final touches on their new home, a modest house built on a hill overlooking the creek, with a wide front porch and windows positioned to catch both the morning sun and the evening breeze. It wasn't the grand mansion Cain had planned to build, but it was theirs in every sense that mattered. Knox had designed it himself, incorporating little touches that spoke of his understanding of what made Vivian happy. Built-in bookshelves for her growing collection of literature, a sunny nook where she could grade papers and plan lessons, a workshop where he could pursue his woodworking without disturbing her work. "I have something for you," Knox said, reaching into his shirt pocket and pulling out a small velvet box. "I know we already have wedding rings, but I thought, given how our marriage began, you might like to choose something for yourself this time." Vivian opened the box to find 2 matching gold bands, simple but beautifully crafted, each engraved with tiny wildflowers around the circumference. They were nothing like the ostentatious diamond bracelet Cain had forced on her, nothing like the expensive baubles he had used to mark his territory. These rings spoke of partnership and choice, of a love that didn't need to announce itself, with flashy displays. "They're perfect," she said, meaning it completely. "But Knox, you didn't need to." "I wanted to," he interrupted gently. "I wanted us to have something that belonged only to us, something that represented what we've built together rather than the circumstances that brought us together." As he slipped the new ring onto her finger, Vivian found herself thinking of how far they had both traveled from that desperate night when she had arrived at his cabin, fleeing Cain's violence. The woman who had married Knox Morrison in a panic had been running away from something. The woman who exchanged rings with him now was choosing to run toward something, toward a future built on honesty and mutual respect. "There's something else," Knox said, his voice taking on a note of nervous excitement that made her look at him more closely. "Something I've been wanting to discuss with you." "What is it?" Knox gestured toward the partially built house, then toward the schoolhouse, then finally toward the rebuilt community that surrounded them. "All of this, the school, the town, the people coming back, it's going to need leadership. Real leadership. Not the kind Cain provided through fear and corruption." Vivian waited, sensing that whatever he was about to say was important to him. "Marshal Hawthorne approached me last week," Knox continued. "The territorial governor is looking for someone to serve as the new sheriff here, someone the community trusts, someone who understands what it means to protect rather than intimidate." The implications of his words hit her like a physical blow. "Knox, that's wonderful. You'd be perfect for the job. You have the respect of everyone in town. And after what you did to stop Cain, I told him I'd only consider it if you thought it was a good idea," Knox interrupted. "This decision affects both of us, Vivian. Being a sheriff's wife isn't easy, and I won't make that choice for you the way Cain tried to make choices for you." The consideration in his words, the automatic inclusion of her in a decision that would shape their future, was so fundamentally different from the way Cain had approached their relationship that it took her breath away. This was what partnership looked like. Not one person making decisions and the other following along, but 2 people facing the future together as equals. "What do you think?" she asked. "Is it something you want to do?" Knox was quiet for a moment, considering the question with his usual thoughtfulness. "I think," he said finally, "that for too many years I stood by and watched while bad things happened to good people. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I wasn't strong enough to make a difference. But that night, when we faced down Cain, when we chose to fight for what was right instead of what was safe, I realized that strength isn't about the size of your fists or the speed of your gun. It's about the willingness to stand up when standing up matters." "Then yes," Vivian said without hesitation. "Yes, you should take the job. This community needs someone who understands that real strength comes from protecting the weak, not exploiting them. Knox's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, transforming his entire face with its warmth. "Are you sure? It won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is," Vivian interrupted, echoing words he had spoken to her months ago when their future had seemed impossibly uncertain. "But we've already proven we can face difficult things together." As the sun set over Cedar Falls, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Knox and Vivian sat together on the steps of the schoolhouse they had helped to build, planning a future that would be shaped by their choices rather than their circumstances. Behind them, the community that had survived Cain Morrison's reign of terror was slowly healing, rebuilding not just their homes and businesses, but their faith in the possibility of justice. In Vivian's hand, the new wedding rings caught the last light of day, simple gold bands that represented something precious beyond their material value, the promise that love, when built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose, could weather any storm. And in Knox's workshop, waiting to be finished, sat a rocking horse he was carving for the child they hoped to welcome in the spring. A child who would grow up in a world where strength meant protection, where love meant freedom to choose, and where the quiet courage of good people had proven stronger than all the violence and corruption that evil men could devise. The wooden horse was perfectly proportioned, its lines flowing and graceful, crafted with the same patient love that had built their marriage, their community, and their hope for tomorrow. It would be ready when the time came, just as they would be ready for whatever challenges the future might bring. Together,